Don't leave wiggle room in your land development regulations. Wiggle room makes land developers nervous. It creates opportunities for abuse by people in local government, and it's going to deter economic development in your community. You know, there are still a few communities in California that care about economic development. There's not many, but there are a few. A lot of those communities I find right here in the California Central Valley. There's a real difference between what we find in the Bay Area and what we find here in the California Central Valley. To be clear, to be fair, there are groups of people in the Bay Area that still think economic development is important, but it's a very challenging development environment. And even in the California Central Valley, we run into folks sometimes in local government that are not very supportive of land development in their communities. So I want to talk to those folks, though, in California communities, and this could be in local government or in business, that do care about economic development and land development and want to attract land developers to their communities. And what I want to do is I want to explain why, when you have wiggle room in your regulation of land use and land development, how that can really serve as a deterrent to land developers. And this is something I care about because I regularly deal with these local communities, and I'm trying to help land developers get their projects approved and built. And so I see this wiggle room all the time, and I see how it's abused. I've been working on. We've got two commercial subdivisions that were kind of being processed in parallel, both here in Central California, and I saw examples in both of these projects of how wiggle room in the local land use regulations were being used to kind of to put my client through the ringer, to kind of beat on my client a little bit. So here's what I want you to understand. If you're in economic development, this is what I want you to understand about your land use regulations and the wiggle room that you put in there. First of all, your regulation of land use and building, it may not seem critical, but it is critical. Now, there's other things that are important to economic development, like a well-trained workforce and educational opportunities and, amenities that make your community an enjoyable place to live. But really, fundamentally, the ability to adapt, change, and create new land uses and to develop land is really key to having an economically vibrant city or community. So the regulation of land use and building is really important. And it's hard. It's hard for people in local government and for people in economic development. And sometimes they struggle with this because there's usually not one kind of poison pill in the land development regulation that really slows stuff down. It's more of a death by 1,000 cuts. So it's all these little pockets of wiggle room in your land development regulation that can really hamper development. And so, on its face, when you look at your land development regulations, they can seem reasonable. But when you really drill down and get into it, you can see there's room for abuse by people in local government that are opposed to development or have other biases and prejudices. And the death by the 1,000 cuts principles applies. And we like to think that in a place like California that we don't have prejudice or abuse by local government officials, but it's not true. I have a client of Middle Eastern descent that has really struggled to be a successful developer in his community, and I really believe, based on what he shared with me, that some of that is just prejudice at the local government agency. And so when you have wiggle room in your land development regulation and your building permit regulations, that wiggle room gives opportunities for that discrimination to happen. So don't leave wiggle room in your regulations. What is wiggle room? I want to explain what wiggle room is. And I've got two basic things, maybe three. Three things I'm talking about when I talk about wiggle room, okay? One is rules that are unclear. If the rule's unclear, that gives the local agency room to interpret the rules and potentially change the rules after the fact, okay? So my clients don't like rules that aren't clear. We like clear rules, okay? I want the rules to be black and white whenever possible. The second thing is, if you have rules, what I call discretionary rules, they're rules that allow the local government official a huge amount of discretion. My clients don't like that either. For the same reason, it introduces uncertainty and it leaves room for discrimination. And then the third thing is open-ended fees. A lot of agencies have open-ended fees. They say, yeah, there's one local agency I deal with, a county, they say, yeah, bring us a check for $10,000 and you have no idea what our final bill is going to be. We're not going to tell you. We're going to bill you T&M. That's really tough. I don't think local agencies should be able to do that in California. And even if they're legally allowed to do it, man, that sure is a turnoff for development clients. There's just a lot of uncertainty there. So again, those three things, rules that are unclear. And an example is, there's some really crazy building setback requirements in California. I've got another video I'll link to in the comments that talks about the building setbacks in Palo Alto. Just stuff like that. If you need a PhD to understand the land use regulation, it's a problem. Rules that are unclear, rules that are too discretionary, and open-ended fees. If you've got those three things in your land use or building permit regulations, you are discouraging economic development in your community. Now, I want to focus on just one of those three today. I want to focus on discretionary rules. So rules that just allow the local government agency folks to have too much discretion. So I want to give you some examples. These are real-life examples that have happened to me in the last 12 months on projects right here in Central California. So here's one. You got a rule that says the agency may or may not require a technical report. So I had a city that said, we may or may not require a full geotechnical report for you to get your subdivision approved. That's all it says. So, of course, we went to the city and we said, we don't think we need a geotechnical report. We're not building yet. We're just creating lots. We're happy to get a geotechnical report when we are ready to pull a building permit. But right now, we just want to create the lots. We don't want to build anything. Your code says you can waive the requirement for a full geotechnical report. Can we get it waived? They said no. So we told the planner, we want to talk to your boss. We talked to the boss. We said, we'd like to get this waived. We don't think it's needed. Can we get it waived? They said no. And here's the problem with the code. The code doesn't explain when it's reasonable to get the requirement for the full report waived. Right? And I'll give you an example to me of what would be reasonable. If the code said, if you're in these particular parts of the city where we know we have, parts of the county where we know we have geotechnical issues, geohazards, we're going to require a report. Okay, that's a little more clear. Now the planner could say, hey, you're in this hazardous soil zone or you're near this fault line. That's why we need the full report. That I can go back and explain to my client, right? But when the planner just says, no, we're just going to make you do the report because we feel like it, my clients have a hard time swallowing that. That's a tough pill to swallow, right? So that's an example of a discretionary rule. Here's another discretionary rule. Real life story. This happened to me on a project. The municipal code said we may require a public hearing on your tentative map. Okay, great. So I asked the planner, I said, hey, my client would like to waive the requirement for a public hearing. We don't think it's required. These lots were already developed. We were just subdividing an existing commercial use. We complied with all the zoning. We didn't need a zoning variance or a general plan amendment. There weren't going to be improvements built. Like, this thing is slam dunk, as simple as you get. And the city engineer said, no, I'm not going to waive the requirement for a public hearing. We said, why not? The engineer said, well, because I don't want to. It was super frustrating for my client, right? Well, under what circumstances is it reasonable? If it wasn't our circumstances, then what circumstances would it be reasonable to waive the requirement for a public hearing? And if you never waive the requirement for a public hearing, then why does your code say that you will? Just say in your code, we require a public hearing every time. Now, they wouldn't waive the requirement for a public hearing, so we had to have it. You know how many people showed up to the public hearing? Nobody showed up to the public hearing, right? So it was just complete waste of taxpayer money, right? I'm like, look, you want to require a public hearing for the subdivision? I get it. My client and I need to know that going in. If you say you're going to waive it, then make it clear when it's reasonable to expect that waiver, right? Don't play games, because that's not cool. It's very frustrating for my client. Okay, here's another example. Your code might say, we may require a secondary access road for your project. Oh, okay, that could be a huge cost. When? When do you require it? Well, we require it if slopes are over 5% and you're in a high fire hazard area. All right, okay, that makes sense. Those are reasonable rules. I can find out ahead of time. My client can estimate that cost. When do you require secondary access? When we feel like it. When the planning director says he wants one. Okay, well, That doesn't make any sense, right? It's just, you're leaving it just like, it depends on the mood he's in, depends on what his kid's report card looked like that week, right? It's very hard to deal with and to plan with as a developer. Last example. This is some actual code in a city that I'm working with right now. And the code says, in the zoning, it gives you a list of allowed uses. And then there's this little note at the end that says, but if the planning director decides that your particular use isn't something that he likes, then he can disallow it. I read that, it blew my mind. I was like, seriously? They've got that in the code? It totally leaves it up to his discretion. Like, they might as well have not had the rest of the zoning code in there for that zone. They should have just said, they should have called it the land planner zone, LPZ, right? Like, what can you do here? Whatever the land planning department says you can do, right? That's this unacceptable wiggle room, right? Makes it very hard for a developer to understand if he's going to be able to build a profitable project. Don't do that. Make the rules clear, right? Say, hey, these are the by right uses, right? These are the uses that require a permit, And I'm not worried about a little bit of gray area, like, okay, if you're running a vineyard, if you have a vineyard and you're doing wine tasting and weddings, like, is that agricultural or not? All right, yeah, that's nuanced. I understand that. And I'm not asking public agencies to hand me a Bible. I think it's great if you could clarify that, but I'm not asking agencies to do that all the time. But there's a difference between, talking to the planning department about what is and isn't an agricultural use and the code saying, well, we might let you do this or we might not. It just depends on what we feel like that week. Those are two different things, right? Okay, so when I have this conversation with folks at local governments, and especially with people in economic development offices, they often say, well, we know there's wiggle room in our code, but why can't you guys just come talk to us when you have a project? Come find out what we mean. We'll tell you what we think it means. All right, well, I have 3 reasons why that doesn't work. I've got 3 reasons why developers don't like that. And I'm not saying that we won't have a conversation with you. We always have a conversation with the agency before we start a project, but I can't bank on that, and neither can my development clients. And here's why. 3 reasons. 1, staff changes. I start my project, I have a conversation with Bob. Bob tells me it's no problem to have wine tastings on my vineyard. That's an acceptable agricultural use. It's not clear in the code. Bob retires or he takes a job with the city down the road. You get a new director. They don't like guys from Montana. I'm from Montana. All of a sudden they tell me, yeah, tasting room on your project's got to come out. We don't allow wine tastings in agricultural zones. It sounds funny, but it happens, and it's happened to me before multiple times. Okay, so staff changes. Second thing is the political mood changes, right? So maybe you've got the staff that tell you, hey, it's okay to have a tasting room on a vineyard in an agricultural zone, and they still believe that. To this day, they believe that, but the political mood changes. And now the county board of supervisors says, no, they come down on staff. They say no more tasting rooms in agricultural zones. We're having too many problems. And so now the staff is going to interpret the rule differently because the political conditions have changed. And then finally, neighbors change, right? So you could have a neighbor that loves you. They sell, get a new neighbor. New neighbor doesn't like your project. They're down, beating on the counter at the local staff, yelling at the local staff. And all of a sudden, staff are going to have a different interpretation. This is why developers don't like wiggle room. We don't like wiggle room in the development code, the land use code. We don't like wiggle room in the code that we need to pull a building permit. We like certainty. We can't plan profitable projects if the local agency is changing the rules of the game midway through the process. I understand in California, local governments have the right to make the rules. I just want to know what the rules are before I start playing the game in your city or county. And that's what my clients want. So, if you are in business or economic development and you want to encourage robust development in your city or county, don't leave wiggle room in your code that regulates land use or building permits. And here's what I encourage you. Next time you're going to do a general plan or a specific plan, or you're going to modify your zoning, don't just hire professional planners, right? A lot of those folks, there's good planners, but a lot of them are academic, come from a strong academic background. Not a lot of them have, 20 years of experience building real world projects. Involve your development community involve your land surveyors and your private land planners and your civil engineers that are actually working to get projects built, and weed that wiggle room out of your code. You can't do it overnight. Like I said, there's 1,000 different places where it lives. But the more that wiggle room you can eliminate, the more effective you will be at encouraging developers to build beautiful, livable projects in your city or your county.